point of view I took, which was very obvious the first session and the second session, was that of someone who would be planning liturgy or be thinking about some kind of ministry. And when Father and I talked about it, we certainly had that in mind as a starting point. But we realized that really, ultimately, the most important thing to cover these days is what should people expect of them and what should they expect when they come into a church. The second thing, then, Anna suggested she'd like to know more, to talk about more about Psalmody. It was obvious from the presentation that I tried to put together last week that Psalmody is not only the thing right now, it's where the church is focused on liturgical development, but it's also, of course, an extremely rich topic with many parts to it, and one that should be of interest to everyone because the Psalms are, after all, they're spontaneous prayers, apparently, that ended up poetic and in the style of the guitarist, the kind of Bob Dylan of their times, where it was sort of the bard, and yet it ends up in their inspired works, and they become then the pattern for all kinds of things that follow. And so Psalms are extremely important in the liturgy, there's no question about that. So those are the two topics I decided we would concentrate on this. I'm reminded, though, of when I was studying dogmatic theology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, and the professor decided he would devote the entire semester to the angels. Well, all right, the result, it was, and of course we were studying the angelic doctor anyway, Thomas Aquinas, maybe that was probably, I don't know, but anyhow, though, it was very, very interesting, but mostly I got a lot of sleep during that particularly. Actually, I'd fall asleep. It was in French, so I'd fall asleep after about 15 minutes of the lecture anyway, because I could only handle about that much, and the processing in my mind. My experience of Freiburg, as I tell about some other time, because it was mainly a linguistic experience. The dogs knew more German than I did, so I really felt out of place. But so I made a point of it, since my last name it's in Alsace, the Y would have an umlaut over it if you spelled it correctly in Alsatian dialect. And my great-grandmother lived about 1 mile from here when I was a little boy. She was born in France. So anyhow, over there I learned a little bit about language, but also, though, I learned about just how important the Psalms were going to be in the new liturgy. Because that was the late 1960s. The changes had taken place only 2 years before. And if we need to start out with another little more exasperating mirth, 20 years later, we celebrated a retrospective on liturgical changes, and I got to go to it. It was at Notre Dame University. And Dr. Fred Molek, he's now retired, much to the loss of Seton Hill University. But anyhow, he announced, we're going to have a Scola. For those of you who would like to help out a little bit, we'll have a little program we're going to do on Wednesday night during the month. I thought, well, I can volunteer for that. So I did, not knowing what I was getting into. Well, it was entertainment. But anyhow, Fred comes out and he says, now, you remember that when we first began the liturgy, there are a lot of things that had to be fixed. One of the things was that there was a lack of really enough inclusive language, and there's a lot of exclusive terms were used. So let's sing one of the very famous songs, and whenever you get to a word that's too inclusive, clap your hand instead. Well, the opening song was "Of God," which is, of course, which you don't sing anymore, fortunately. It goes boom, 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 boom. Sons of God, hear his holy word. So it was about like that. And then if you knew the Psalms of Father Lucien Dess, they really were very good. But we did them and did them and did them over and over again. And so he said, well, let's do, instead of covering them all, let's just do the opening lines of a bunch of them. Let's see how it works. And so we had pieces flowing like olive branches and so on and so forth. And then finally this nun comes out. She's a nun with a nice gray veil, a very young nun. She comes out and she goes, "Someone's waiting, Lord." And we all go, "Kumbaya." And then someone's waiting. Then she goes, "Someone's interfacing, Lord. Kumbaya," etc. So we went through a lot during those 20 years of liturgical change. Here's an example of what resulted. This came out last year. In fact, it's so new that I had to order it. The sisters in Culver City didn't have it yet. And so I was surprised by that. And it's only in this small book that we could find it. This is the new Psalter, the new one that was approved for use for singing. In my opinion, not all of the particular translations are eminently singable. This is called the New Grail. Now, the Old Grail is what we often call the Gélineau Psalms, named for Joseph Gélineau, who died at the age of 99 a few years ago, the French Jesuit who really developed that along with Father Clifford Howell, the English Jesuit, and several other English, Dom Gregory Murray, the English Benedictine, and so on. The Psalmody for singing, such as the ones we use for the dedication. Those are both Gélineau Psalms, if you remember. The one what is it? We shall go up with joy to the house of the Lord. That's a Gélineau Psalm, or some get the Jelly Roll Psalms. But anyhow, those are very, very good. They were very successful. They came out before liturgical changes, 1956. So they were very, very forward-looking. This is the New Grail, which is less metrical, a little more sophisticated. Listen to it. This is our opening prayer. Psalm 73, a psalm of Asaph. How good is God to Israel, to those who are pure of heart. As for me, I came close to stumbling. My feet had almost slipped, for I was filled with envy of the proud, when I saw how the wicked prosper. For them there are no pains. Their bodies are sound and sleek. They do not share in people's burdens. They are not stricken like others. So they wear their pride like a necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. With folds of fat their eyes protrude. With imagination their hearts overflow. They scoff. They speak with malice. From on high they threaten oppression. They have set their mouths in the heavens, and their tongues are roaming the earth. So the people turn to them and drink in all their words. They say, how can God know? Does the Most High have any knowledge? Look at them. Such are the wicked. Ever prosperous, they grow in wealth. How useless to keep my heart pure and wash my hands in innocence, when I was stricken all day long, suffered punishment with each morning. Then I said, if I should speak like that, I should betray your children's generation. I strove to fathom this problem. Too hard for my mind to understand, until I entered the holy place of God and came to discern their end. How slippery the paths on which you set them. You make them fall to destruction. How suddenly they come to their ruin, swept away, destroyed by terrors. Like a dream one wakes from, O Lord. When you wake, you dismiss them as phantoms. And so when my heart grew embittered, and I was pierced to the depth of my being, I was stupid and did not understand. I was like a beast in your sight. As for me, I was always in your presence. You were holding me by my right hand. By your counsel you will guide me, and then you will lead me to glory. What else have I in heaven but you? Apart from you, I want nothing on earth. My body and my heart waste away. God is the strength of my heart. God is my portion forever. Surely those who are far from you perish. You destroy all those who are unfaithful. To be near God is my happiness. I have my hope in the Lord God. I will proclaim your works at the gates of daughter Zion. Now, I don't know how singable that is, but it certainly would set to choral music magnificently, wouldn't it, as a cantata? That's a fabulous translation, I'm sure you'll agree. That's the kind of Dr. Blount, the former professor of early music here that I had as a teacher. Well, he's deceased now, I believe. Okay, he's one of my teachers. They're either retired or deceased when I was over here. But he would refer to these lines as delicious. You know, that was when he saw translations like that. That's a gorgeous translation. Now, only sections of that would be sung in liturgy because that's meditative. That not all psalms are really liturgical. But there's passages in there that you've heard in the liturgy, if you recognize them, and certain ones you haven't, which is interesting, by the way. You need to read the Psalms differently at different times. So liturgically, we don't use everything because we tend to sing proclamatory parts of the liturgy and joyful parts and so on, or very simple parts, naturally. But notice the depth of that. That's spiritual direction within a single psalm, isn't it? Marvelous. Okay, but notice the beauty of the translation. And that's what the church is headed for now. That seems to be. But let's go from the point of view at the beginning of the congregation. We're going to get back to that, and we'll have more to talk about it. Let's see if I know what I'm doing here. Okay? All right. And if the transitions are too busy, I'm still learning and playing with them like a little kid. Okay. This gentleman on the right just died a few months ago. He was one of the co-founders of the school. I died at 62. This was children at Mission San Juan Capistrano. They were singing probably Father Serra's Alabado whenever we began liturgy there on Saturday nights with them. They were the children's choir of Capistrano Mission. They would sing the song that was sung at the dedication of all of the missions. It's a beautiful little litany in 18th century Spanish. So every member of the congregation is a minister, though not all have specific ministries. But these lads and lassies certainly did, didn't they, at this particular occasion? They provided something that was very attractive at the little Father Serra's little chapel, which, by the way, is the oldest extant room in California. Okay. But there are three expectations of a member of a congregation. By the way, the word congregant is not just some title of a television mystery series, The Congregant, you know, or like the Saint or something like that. But it actually it is a technical term for a person who is in the congregation. Actuoso participatio cannot be translated into English because we do not have a word for it. Actuous would be the closest thing. Not only being acted, and not only acted and acting, but actuous, that something, a quality about you is inherently active. There's no such word for it in English. It's an example of how sometimes language doesn't have the word, okay? So it's a good reason for sticking to Latin sometimes. So last week, or week before rather, I wrote actuosa participatio because those are the terms in the official Latin text of the Vatican II document, the liturgy. Not whatever it would be active, but actuous. That is to say that the person would come in with the notion that I'm going to do something, that I'm not going to be a passive participant. They would walk in with that expectation. Now, what would that mean? Would differ from person to person, age to age and stuff. But everybody would know that there was something they were supposed to do that would make them a good congregant. That's the point I would like to make, and why I mentioned it right away. Certainly, what the first part of it, and the part that we begin as children doing, and it should continue and take on adult form, and the reason why there's often criticism of modern liturgy is it doesn't take on adult form. It stays at the high God level, okay? Especially sometimes with the music, right? Not as bad as it was 20 years ago, but definitely though, okay? The first thing that happens is we wonder why we're there. We're reminded all over again, like we commented in the very first session. What was it like, your first experience of being in church at all, right? That is it's somehow redone. So it's a thoughtful, reflective, discerning kind of thing. I have reasons for coming in, and part of it is an element of mystery. I'm re-entering mystery again. Mystagogical experience of learning more about God, becoming closer to God in the liturgy. And then as a result, there is going to be a personally expressive but communally expressive response. It's going to be responsive. We are going to respond in the liturgy, not just afterwards when it works on us, but during the liturgy itself. And that, I think, is the most difficult thing to teach. I was thinking that today at St. John Chrysostom Church in England with 9,500 families and all these beautiful children, and wondering how many of them really got something out of the particular Mass this particular day. It's a fair question, after all, because the television producers certainly, at every single program, they ask that, right? We don't ask that enough, I don't think. And then maybe it's a little unrealistic to expect all the time, but it's got to work on them, right? Otherwise, when they get to be 18 or 19, they're totally bored with it, and it doesn't happen again. Okay, so then there's something that has to happen before they will become expressive. And I think that area right there in the middle then is where a lot of work has to be done in liturgical planning, making the liturgy so interesting that we know our week is going to be perfected by it. That's really important. But let's go back to actuosa participatio for a moment and give in and use the English word and call it active participation. Again, it's not a basketball game, but it is active. Okay. First of all, there are gestures. The walking into church itself is a gesture. Some people trudge in. People are late. If they're a little earlier, it's often a good sign, or they just got early on an early ride or something. Any number of reasons. But definitely gestures are all over the place. And prayer postures come into play. The whole question, for example, that kneelers were literally thrown out of churches in the 1970s. Suddenly, kneelers are in again. But I don't think people know when to stand and when to kneel, really. I don't think that's been catechized. They just do what the group does, right? But certainly kneeling is an important prayer posture. We never see Mary standing during the Annunciation, for example, in the paintings. You know, it doesn't seem right. Okay, all right. But anyhow, though, that the various prayer postures, how does a person, do they genuflect or bow on the way in? Those kinds of things need to be catechized. But above all, during the liturgical action itself, yes. Why do we kneel during Mass? Well, first of all, we didn't kneel during Mass until the 1700s when the Protestants began sitting. Okay, we didn't kneel that much. Okay. Because we did not have any benches in our churches, in our cathedrals in Europe, because we were only Europeans, number one, okay? And that's how it was done. In fact, if you go to a 13th century cathedral, it's all portable chairs they bring in, with little kneelers in front, right? Very few of them have. They stood standing, like they do in the Orthodox Church in the Eastern Rite. And then gradually kneelers were brought in. I think the English started doing it, though, in the Sarum Rite. I'm really not sure anymore. It may have come in earlier, because kneeling definitely was prostrate, and so when we use the word kneel, and it's very clear that there were genuflections in the liturgy already in the third and fourth centuries. So people were kneeling, but not for long periods of time. Okay. Well, that by the time, I guess I have to correct what I said, because by the time Trent comes along, people are expected to kneel right on the concrete, right on the stone floor, I mean, because that's what they did, see? And then eventually said, well, let's give them something so they don't get surfer's knee so easily. They didn't use that word, but you know what I mean. And so eventually then we put kneelers on. And then when they began sitting down to listen to the sermon, and so on, which they basically had learned from the Protestants, then the concept of having the pews in the chair, chairs, bancas or pews, or call them, and then kneelers in front of them, was developed. And then the newer churches built after the French Revolution all had benches and kneelers. So, and then around the world, but not completely. In Africa, they don't use them as much. See, so it's a good question. Whereas in Mexico, they use them a lot. Kneeling's big. Kneeling's really big in the Mexican culture. When an older Mexican man makes his pilgrimage to Tepeyac, he gets at the doorway and on his knees makes it up to the talpa, right? And he makes his lifetime Guadalupe procession. It's very touching. Well, there's two forms of kneeling too. Don't forget. You genuflect on both knees if you walk into a church during the Eucharistic prayer. And you should genuflect on both knees and bow if you're reversing the Blessed Sacrament exposed in the monstrance. See, so there are customs that developed gradually over it. And then that's the whole point. And then these gestures are meaningful. If you get older like me, and genuflecting is not easy for me anymore, then you go back to the older form, which was a profound bow. And the priest is allowed to do either one on the way in and out, in liturgy, even in the Tridentine Rite. See, so there's a lot of options and national differences involved there. And so the answer is why? Is because people did it. Not because there's a tremendously important reason, but rather the reasons came about gradually. In the same way that most LA churches give out Holy Communion from the back row to the front, because they began doing that in Africa as a sign of humility. They would offer it to the humblest who stayed in the back of church first, and so on. And even those giving out communion wouldn't get it until afterwards. And then Rome said, well, now wait a minute. If they're ministers of the altar, they should get it first. And then Rome never changed it. And it turned out that it came from Africa by way of Chicago. Went all the way down through the various liturgical gatherings, and everybody took it as being a new liturgical law. Okay, and of course it's very uncustomary, but it just sort of happened. But there was a reason for it originally. Now I don't think people they just automatically do it. See, so once in a while there's a reason in the beginning. Well, they do. If it's done in a Mexican-American church like here, in most of our churches here in Los Angeles, it's kneeling because that's what you should do during the Eucharistic prayer. That's what nice people do. See, but not in the college liturgy necessarily. See. At our student body masses at Chaminade Preparatory, the children will all be standing during Eucharistic prayer. They're in benches. They're in bancas, like what do you want to call them? They're the bleachers. They don't bleach. They're not outdoors, but you know what I mean. There's those portable bleachers you pull out, and they all are on the benches all along on either side, right? Well, they can't kneel anyway. They're standing. So there's a new custom that came out that's very definitely in germ. It's in the instruction that says that if you're standing at liturgy, when the priest reverences the Eucharist, either with a genuflection or a profound bow, you make a profound bow. So we teach the kids that. We whisper to them and say, don't forget the new custom and stuff. And of course, oh yeah, they do it, see. And so gradually, so I think the answer to your question, and I appreciate that right along here, is that the gesture should fit the particular combination of people, should not be jarring, and should make sense. The gesture should definitely not require people to have to think too much about what they are or feel uncomfortable. That shouldn't be necessary. Okay. All right, so we're going to continue. So the third thing along is sacred song, and then the fourth thing, of course, all things are important. I think one thing that really bothers me is I believe a lot of our priests do not realize the importance of eye contact and to realize that the congregations can tell if the priest is really looking around and seeing people. I'm sure you agree with that, because you're so good at it yourself, but we know that a lot of the guys aren't. They just don't know. They weren't trained for that, didn't think about that. If they had to make a buck and a nightclub entertainer in a small little place in Las Vegas, some little corner place, they'd learn real fast. Like that opening scene in Sister Act where nobody's paying attention to the singers, and they're not paying attention to anybody either, right? That would be exhausting. That can happen in church. So all of that goes to, okay, let's move along here. But if that's the case, then, if everybody is a minister of some kind coming in as a member of a congregation, what are some of the elements and how does one grow in it and so on? By the way, that's the chapel at Sedona, Arizona, if you've never seen it. It's really worth seeing. It's gorgeous. Okay. Remember the word Mass comes from the closing phrase, ite missa est, because the people heard that and they began calling the liturgy a missa. But of course, it has an important meaning. It means go, this is your mission. It's just been celebrated, now extended out to the acts of charity and goodness in building the faith community. So the call to ministry at the very end says, okay, now do something about it. There are distinct liturgical roles people can be called to, and I think this is really important. They're all roles of the laity. They require the people to be laity for them to work. They're not ordained ministry roles and shouldn't be. So a priest should not be doing, a deacon should not be doing one of the preliminary readings in the liturgy, right? That's it. That would be an exception to the rule because someone else isn't available. That would be an example. Okay. And preparation, of course, has to take place. They have to know what people know what they're doing. It's not enough to just say, "Would you say mass? Would you serve mass or something like that?" It doesn't. Well, yeah, you get the idea. And then usually parishes will have some kind of installation ceremony and maybe a little medallion or something that people wear when they're helping with communion or they're reading, or any number of possibilities there. And I know that there's big debates here on what people should wear here with the college liturgy, and I won't go into it because I'm irresponsible in that regard. And then the last point is the element of continuing education, because liturgy is a spiral curriculum and it should be treated as such. These are needed ministries in liturgy. I began, if you recall, with the fact that an usher or greeter, or the Anglicans call them the verger. I don't know what that proves, because maybe people are on the verge of entering the church. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, I don't know. But anyhow, though, that's an important phase, and I think that maybe it isn't done enough. The Lutherans are great at it, by the way. That's the first ministry people learn in the Lutheran Church as a lay member of the Lutheran Church, is to learn how to greet others and to take on that role as a volunteer so that someone's at the door. Oh, hello, will you help you to your seat? And so on like that. Are you new here? Things of this nature. And as effective as it is here, and I believe it is, the way there's a general common greeting at the beginning, right before Mass, even better would be have someone at the door. There's no doubt about that. If we can eventually pull that off, if the committee can eventually do that. And then, of course, you have the office of lector. There are two forms of reading. One is declamatory and one is instructional. Instructional would be in, for example, Compline, and in the declamatory is would be in Eucharistic liturgy, for example, or baptism or something like that. The acolyte or mass server, often just we use the word server nowadays, can be, of course, a boy or a girl, always could be, by the way. It's a baptized person, and it should be a baptized person. They're ministering at the altar, and their main duty is to make sure the priest has help at the altar, but also to represent the congregation, showing reverence for the gifts. And you do that so well as a sacristan, and it's nice to see. And then a chorister is a person who sings better, not necessarily a member of a choir, cantoral groups and so on. Now, of course, there are more formalized roles of chorister depending on the kind of church and so on and so forth. And a chorister, actually, that term is used for child choir members technically too, as you know. The sacristan's a very important person. And you have to be careful of some of the phraseology in the history of sacristans. They used to say that the devil appeared as a sacristan once in a while to tempt St. Pius X, but we don't really know if that's true. Thank you very much. And the role of cantor is very, very important. The cantor is not a member of the congregation alone. He's a person leading the congregation, but he's not singing to the congregation. He's singing with the congregation. Yeah.
May we interject with questions?
Please do, yeah, go ahead.
Last week you talked a little bit about how the liturgical experience begins even before you enter the church, from what the building says to you, and then I guess ushers would play a part in that. And I'm curious as to, since you got to the chorister, what are your thoughts in terms of any kind of liturgical prelude music as people enter in, and does that have a defined place in all of this?
There's no doubt about the fact that if you want to get people to talk in church before, just have the choir obviously rehearsing and talking with each other, and it creates the mood that it's not right. It's not a church right now. And the opposite of that would be if there's something going on that's definitely formalized. I have difficulty, for very personal reasons anyway, when I hear recordings of Gregorian chant right before the liturgy, not because it's bad, but because I wish that we're live singing, that's why. And I think it should be live music if at all possible. So it's not the music, it's beautiful music. But playing a recording just says that there's nobody available to do something. There are plenty of people around here that, for example, ask Tomomi to play the piano, to play the Brahms that she played during the offertory of the Mass at the dedication. It's gorgeous, and it's perfect for meditation music. And so, I mean, there are things like that should be going on, but preferably it would be a variation upon the melody of the opening hymn. So it's in people's ear, and they're not even aware of it. And then when it comes time to sing along, they already know the tune. But no one told them, now listen to it carefully. They heard it anyway, see. That's really more natural. The Lutherans are great at that. And Johann Sebastian Bach and his family and his contemporaries called it the choral prelude. Choral preludium, they said in German. The choral prelude, because it's a prelude to the chorale, which is a type of hymn that the Lutherans sing at the beginning of their liturgy, which is a metrical hymn. It's not a psalm in psalmic form, because Luther thought that was too difficult for the people. Instead, he created hymn tunes based on the psalms. He was the first one to do that. Oh, Martin Luther's an interesting person. Okay, so anyhow, you have those. The music director is very important, but I use the word music director there because I think more important is what goes on behind the scenes in that regard and the long-term planning. For example, you cannot expect a congregation to sing a brand new hymn at the opening of the Mass. That'll never work. They'll never do it. They'll hum along kind of if they try. But if you use it at a time where it doesn't matter whether they sing along or not, like at the offertory, which is quiet anyway, and do it then. Or use it as a prelude for several weeks. See, it's part of it, as part of a series preludes, but don't use it yet. They've heard it then, and then bring it in. So you have to do that. So the music director's main job is to gradually create a repertoire and so on. And that takes a lot of thinking and planning and knowing your group. I love this picture of Julio. He was 16 when we went up to Sequoia with the choir. We were singing at the town of Exeter, singing Mass there when we had a little spring tour, and I took this picture of him in front of the General Sherman tree playing classical guitar, and thought to myself, well, the psalmist probably would do something like that. Anyhow, let's talk about the art of the psalmist. This is where we wanted to, I wanted to really do this for Anna, and I guess they're getting ready for the next liturgy, aren't they? But I guess this will be online anyway, won't it? So that's good. So the first psalmist, we don't know a lot about them. We know that they were during the reign of King David, or near thereabouts. And the Davidic psalmist basically used a little harp, chant-like, and once in a while people sang along, but mostly the psalmist was a soloist. And the soloist would represent the people. And they would have all kinds of different emotions, just the way the modern popular ballad does. So that you'll see that in the Psalms. It's very clear that any emotion, you can be mad at God in the way that a child is confused by its parents, and so on. It's all in there. The Psalms have everything. Being angry with God, but it's always in a childlike anger. Well, why are you doing this to me, Lord? That kind of, but it's all like almost an anger, like a very small child. And it's perfectly normal and very much of spiritual growth. And at the same time, too, rejoicing in the Lord and always attributing everything to the work of God ultimately. That's very much the Psalms. So they're magnificent, and yet they began very humbly, literally like a guitarist sitting in front of some place and singing about things. Very much the bard, the troubadour. And then gradually, actually, when the church came out of the catacombs completely, and Constantine said that Christianity could be practiced completely in public in the year 314, Pope Sylvester, whose feast day is the 29th of December in the Christmas octave, he was the Pope at that time, created what he called a school of singers who would take the spirit of the psalmist and make it more communal, and you could begin to have a public liturgy patterned after the Jewish services that the people knew already, and the various ceremonies of the Greek and Roman empires. So gradually this came about, and the mother church of Christianity is St. John at the Lateran Gate. They named it for a saint because we know that that's where they tried, by custom says that's where the Romans tried to execute St. John. It did not succeed so because he just got right out of the pot of boiling oil, preserved by the Lord. But anyhow, though, that St. John, so the Pope's parish church is not St. Peter's, that's a chapel, but rather it's the St. John at the Lateran Gate. Okay, and beautifully restored, by the way, under Leo XIII. Ironically, since Leo never saw it because he was a prisoner of the Vatican during that time. Okay, but anyhow, though, gorgeous place. So then after that, then gradually the word chorus or choir took over, but school of singers was the beginning. And notice it wasn't the idea of a choir as separate, but rather people who sang, who animated song. It was to really, basically to train psalmists in the beginning, which is what it's come back to now, I think, in modern times. Along the way, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Those positions in the scholas, would those be kind of, how do I say, like a sort of revered positions that only recognized?
Eventually. In the beginning, it was probably anybody who wanted to do it. But again, they would begin as children. It became the first schools in Europe were choir schools. The kids, most people didn't go to school. But if you went to school, it was probably because you're going to be a chorister. So that was through Alcuin, in the 800s. Alcuin was a monk in northern France, and Charlemagne said, start schools. We want boys to sing in the church and we want them, some of them to become priests, and some of them are going to become lawyers and leaders and soldiers and so on in government, and they need to be able to read. And so the choir schools began. That was the parochial school system, as we know it, is the original school system of Europe. It began for that purpose. So, and it began literally at 314 in Rome, they call the Scola Laterana. Still exists, the oldest choir in the world. Okay, but eventually certain instruments were developed. The harp is replaced by the lute, which today becomes the guitar. The little pipes and so on and flutes or so on are organized into a form where they could literally they were organized, so they were called organum. And they took the name of organ, and you could play them with keys. And they were developed in the 1300s, that late. The oldest playable organ in the world, I got a chance to play on it, is in Sion, Switzerland. It dates from the 1300s. And so it's a very old instrument. And eventually the organist choir master concept developed, where that would be the skill that was needed. And so the title that Johann Sebastian Bach had, he was the cantor of Leipzig. He was called the cantor, K-N-T-O-R, of Leipzig. Even though he was an organist, the word cantor was applied then to a choir master. And, maître de chœur, the French say master of choristers in England, and we say that, the Anglicans say that in the United States and stuff like that. So gradually it became a much more structured thing and much more separate professional thing. See, what happened to the liturgy, of course, then, is the participational aspect seems to be less and less the people, doesn't it, as I described this, see? And that's what happened historically, and Trent didn't worry about that. Trent was busy making sure that people understood what the Mass was, basically, and not the participational element. And at that time, too, not everybody read anyway. But now, what happened, though, is that right before Vatican II, the music was found in the hands of sometimes very good, but usually very amateurish or volunteer parish choir. They would, and once in a while, and then there was the Cecilian movement, as it was called, in the 1860s and so on, in the United States, but mainly in Twin Cities and Minnesota, and there was a number of major publishing companies in Leipzig, Germany, and Cincinnati, Ohio, for example, combined, Pustet, and then there was Benziger. In the East and so on in New York. And these different publishing companies would publish better music and stuff like that in the so-called Cecilian movement. In England, they called it, both the Anglicans and the Catholic called it the Gregorian Society. And that was the very beginning. And of course, France, it was the Solesmes monks looking back and trying to create the best possible editions of plain chant after the French Revolution and so on, with Dom Guéranger in 1837 in Solesmes. Near Bordeaux, France. So all of that went on gradually. So the liturgical movement we know about really began before the French Revolution in Austria. And after that, it spreads around a little bit, but very, very gradually, and they didn't know what they were doing yet, you might say, in a lot of ways. And then in 1909 is often said to be the beginning of the real liturgical movement, which was in several monasteries in Central Europe, but we don't have time to talk about all that. But anyhow, though, gradually the notion was to give things better to the parish choir. That's what I'm driving at. And so the classic St. Gregory hymnal, published by Gregorian Institute and republished by them now, that book, which is still used in choirs all over the United States, is an absolute classic for it in 1920, and so on. Okay, so there are some things very good things that happened. And then also the elements somehow, what do we do about the Psalms? These things are hymns mostly, in parts, and people hear them. They don't sing along. The German says, well, why don't you give the hymns back to the people, or do what the Lutherans do, and have them sing hymns? And so the Germans got permission in the 1930s for the Gesangmesse, the sung mass, where they would sing the four hymns, as they're often called: an entrance, an offertory, a communion, and a closing. And that's how come we still seem to have that custom, even though we really don't need it anymore. We still have that custom. Somehow you start with, when you prepare liturgy, you use those, you think of those first. And really you shouldn't. You should think of the responses with the priest first, and the holy and the common of the Mass first, right? And then those decorations. But that was what was needed at the time, was given something to do that was workable. It was a big improvement. And then we were doing it in the 1950s in the Latin Mass in the United States, in the more developed dioceses anyway. Not much in Los Angeles because the West Coast was very, very slow for any liturgical development. For one thing, they were so busy just building their churches that they didn't have time for that kind of thing. And by the time it started to get good, Vatican II happened. And ironically, the activities that begin mostly in St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago and stuff in the Midwest, very actively, because they were ready for it, because of the Chilean movement and stuff like that, spreads to the coast, and the coast takeover, especially Los Angeles, with our Congress now and all that, once a year. Would have never been believed in the 1970s that we would add that much influence. It was still very much the Midwest. St. Louis Jesuits, Chicago liturgical training publications, and so on. They're all big still, right? But now California is very big. And then Oregon, because of the taxation thing, Oregon Catholic Press is really California, stuff like that, So it happened gradually. But the reason why I give you all of this is because look what happens. What goes around comes around. Having done all of this, having formalized many, many things which fit the times over centuries, right? And enabled the Catholic Church to develop a marvelous literature of great choral and instrumental and vocal art, but all of it very studied and instructional, but very studied, very beautiful. What happens is the people are not as involved on a participated basis, but and then finally we get to the very end, that art of the psalmist is almost completely forgotten. That there is this, and then the spontaneity of the psalmist is unheard of. And that's where we come in today, because that's where liturgy is today. Let's take a look at the different types of psalmody. And this is the part that I want Anna to see for sure, because I think this is what she's interested in, so we'll make sure she knows about it, okay? First of all, it begins with spontaneous chanting, We don't do that much. Our culture doesn't have that. You don't say, hello, how are you? About average. We don't do that, We don't say those things. We don't spontaneously chant the way they really did in our Lord's time. The distinction between singing and speech did not exist as clearly as it does today. One reason why is they had no microphones, but you could be better heard if you sang things and stuff like that. There are all kinds of reasons. So that was one of them for sure. Eventually, certain tones, most of them Hebrew in origin, find their way into the early liturgies. So I told you about the one that seems to have dated from the time of Christ. And when they needed an official Latin chant for that, adding in mystery of faith in the newer liturgy, they used that melody, Mysterium Fidei, probably dates from the time of the Lord. And it's still sung in Yemen by very ancient type Jewish congregations and stuff. So, all right. And so they came originally, I'll give you an example. The most common Gregorian tone that people use, because they don't know any better, they don't know any of the other ones, is they'll go da-da-dun, da-dun, da-da-dun-dun. You heard that before? Have you heard that? Praise to the Lord, all you nations. Glorify him, all you peoples. The Jewish form is, praise the Lord, all you nations. Glorify the Lord, all you peoples. Approximately. It's almost identical. And Rome tended to simplify them a little bit, or I should say, the church did. Gradually, they would be developed, these marvelous chant books in the various monasteries, where they would take those melodies and elaborate upon them. They didn't call it musical composition, they called it centonization. That is to say, finds parts, things that are implied. That's how, because it was all monody, it was all melody. And they would find things implied. And they would say, why don't we do it that way? And eventually they used what they called the modes. They had them wrong historically, we know that now, but they took them, they gave them the Greek names. The Greek names they gave them were one note off, and we know that, but everybody uses them because they've been used since the 500s. Okay, so the first tone is the so-called Dorian mode. It goes da 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 dum da 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 dum, and that's the melody, and that's considered dynamic. And its plagal form goes da 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 da, the lower form. Okay, and the third mode is the one that Thomas Aquinas liked very much. It goes pange lingua gloriosi do 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 do, like that, and its plagal form would be oh, what's I think? Doo 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 doo, which I gave you already. All right, and then the fifth mode is the one that it sounds most like the modern scale, the modern major scale. It'd be Salve Regina, doo 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 doo, like that. And its plagal form is Beethoven used it, da 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 dum bum 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 ba da dum, for example, in his Pastoral Symphony. And Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibis is one of the examples in Holy Thursday. And then the seventh mode is the trumpet-like mode. Puer es nobis of Christmas Day, a child is born to us. Sounds like a trumpet, doesn't it? Bum, 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 bum. They use it a lot in the 1950s historic films. They use the seventh mode a lot for their themes because it sounds right. And then the da 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 that I chanted for you is its plagal form. So there are basically really four authentic modes and variations on them that are called plagal modes that just lower the melody a little bit. And instead of having the main note at the bottom, it's in the middle. That's the difference. Yeah, so anyhow, those existed. They were very important in chant, yeah.
Sorry, I just have to ask, how did they get it wrong for 500 years?
Well, because everybody believed Boethius when he wrote that in 500 and no one knew the difference. They didn't have the primary sources. They didn't have them. They were not available in Western Europe. And Western Europe dominated classical music then from that time until now, till World War II anyway. And so the Dorian mode is actually not the Dorian mode. I forget what it would be called. I have to go back and look because I learned it the wrong way, and I've used it the wrong way, and I'm really not very worried. But anyhow, though, but that's it. Okay. You get the idea, though. Eventually, there was a whole system of singing, which didn't exist in the psalmic times with the Davidic psalm singers. Not very much, anyway. There was a little bit of it, but not like it developed in the Middle Ages. It was extraordinary what the monasteries did. And those ended up too in the cathedrals. The little churches did what they could, though. I don't think we should be rhapsodized and romanticized too much about liturgy in small groups. I don't think it was very well developed, and it still isn't, in my opinion. Okay, but anyhow, though. So gradually, though, they developed what they call the proper of the Mass. That is to say, we would apply certain chants and certain textual things to certain liturgy feasts and so on, especially the introit, as I mentioned last week, but also an offertory, antiphon, and so on and so forth. And that would be developed gradually over centuries for about 1,000 years it took to really develop. It was very gradual, literally. During the development after the Reformation, the Anglicans never made as radical a change in their music as the Lutherans did. But what they did is they used the harmonic forms that were developed already by the late Renaissance, and they tried to apply that to congregations and to children's choirs, and they created what is called Anglican chant. It's not really chant, unless you want to call it chordal chant. The Italians call it falso bordone. Falso means artificial, and bordone means burdon, means harmony. It's an old word for harmony. And that's when they harmonize. So, for example, let's see if I can give you an example. Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us rejoice with great thanksgiving. Da 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 dun, da 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 dun. And that tune will be found in all the way through. And that's what the Jelly Note people picked up and created in modern translation form. They basically use Anglican chant very successfully. Anglican chant is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful to hear. If you don't have a recording of Anglican chant, you might look it up and download some examples of it, especially Psalm 150. There's all kinds of marvelous settings of Psalm 150. They're not hard to sing. They're perfect for choirs. They make a perfect thing right after communion, at the beginning. After communion, I mean at the end of communion. If the choir were to sing in 4 parts an Anglican psalm, they're absolutely gorgeous and they're very meditative. And you do it in the King James translation, which always fits better for some reason, and or the way because it fits the style, and it's just absolutely beautiful. That'd be a good example of something that would be very easy to do here. These kids who can read music right off, Okay, so All right, so we still haven't gotten very far, have we? The metrical psalmody is what Luther had introduced and others, where they would take and create a hymn tune that, well, the shepherd of my soul shall guide me, keeping me from fear, where it's definitely a tune like that, and yet that's the Good Shepherd Psalm, for example. That one, by the way, is American in origin and later. But anyhow, metrical psalms, they're really hymns, but they have the psalm theme in them. The idea of having different sides of the church, one's called the decanus or decanus, and the other is a cantorus, meaning to say that the deacon was on this side and the choir was on this side, depending on the particular setup. That the Anglicans use that a lot. The idea of having what we would call two choirs chanting verses or singing verses or reciting verses of a psalm. For example, there's no reason why this couldn't be done here. When you get the responsorial psalm, instead of having it sung, have it recited in two choirs with everybody coming in on the antiphon, the way you would at Compline, or where you should be doing in Compline. They don't do Compline here, of course, really. You know that. They do things from Compline. But Compline, of course, is a very communal prayer. But that would be very typical of a good Compline or a Vesper service. Could be done also during the Mass. It would be very effective. It wouldn't require a choir. It would be excellent on a weekday Mass, where you have one side do one verse, everybody recites the antiphon, and they'll do the other verse. And you don't have to do the two verses followed by the antiphon the way it's written in the Missalette. The Missalette people make that decision pretty much. So you have a lot of variety, you have a lot of freedom of movement with the Psalms in the current liturgy. Okay, so anyhow, though, the idea of separate choirs, of antiphonal singing or reciting and so on comes into play. It's found mainly in the monasteries, but can take place elsewhere too. Grail Psalmody, I talked about already at the beginning, the influence of the ladies of the Grail in England and how they encouraged the singing of psalms and helped bring about the creating of what we call the Jelly-No Psalms. The Revised New American Bible has very, very singable psalmody in it. So much so that I think some of it is more singable than this new edition. But this is the new alternate edition for singing, approved by the American bishops for singing in the United States, published at Conception Abbey in Missouri. Just came out, the one that I quoted in the beginning, as an example of a truly gorgeous translation, no doubt about that. Some of which, as I said, is maybe not singable, but it's eminently recitable. It's just gorgeous English language. And then the last thing I would say is the trend is to go to the current monasteries because they are they're the beginning, they're the fountain of creativity in liturgy. St. Meinrad's in Indiana, several monasteries. We do really very well now, I think, at Vallermo. I'm very impressed. Father Jim and I are making our retreat over the Thanksgiving holiday at Vallermo, and Father Luke, who's a harp player, leads the psalmody and so on, and you've maybe met him. It's just absolutely beautiful. It's not difficult, it's just plain beautiful. So again, but the monasteries are not very commercially oriented, and you have to almost go there to find out what they're doing and then take it and get their permission to use it, because they're just not into too much publishing and stuff. Most of them aren't. However, St. John's in Minnesota is. That's a very important source for liturgical publications. So you can see what has happened is that this tremendously rich history we have is being brought to new life in the liturgy today, where the most educated laity in history wants the best in its little parish church, or this beautiful new church here, where you want the best and you want the most inspirational. And it's just extraordinary what's available today. There's no doubt about that. I don't think we spent a lot of time what was expected of the congregation tonight, but I hope that we did cover a little more on psalmody, because as you can see, the psalm is not just something that's thrown into the liturgy. Initially, what the people sang at liturgy were the psalms, and then the preface, and the thrice holy, the Trisagion, the holy, 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 holy was added in fairly early. And the other stuff was all added in gradually, like the Agnus Dei came in the 1200s, for example, and stuff like that. So but the thing that they began with, they sang psalms and confected the Eucharist. And gradually it became more formalized. By the time we would get to St. Leo the Great, Pope Leo I, we had a structured liturgy, the Leonine Sacramentary. And then when France is converted in the 800s, 700s rather, we have the Gelasian Sacramentary. And by that time, Spain has the Mozarabic, northern Italy has the Ambrosian, and so on and so forth. But only after the Council of Trent do we have an international liturgy. England has the Salisbury Rite called Sarum, and so on. So those things happened very gradually over a long period of time. Yeah.
In 312, what would have been used then? Would that have been?
It's hard to say exactly what was going on in 314 it was. Well, 313 is when it was okay to worship the Christian form in public. By 314, Sylvester had established the Lateran Basilica, and so called because the word basilica means a place where the throne is located, because the people understood that the bishop would use the throne, because that's what they understood, that there'd be some kind of symbolic chair or something, literally. That's how it came up. It's because that's what they did in Rome and in Greece. So that's what they figured that the church should do too. So a lot of what we did was taken from the imperial. That's why we have to be very careful. Remember that was not the essence of Christianity. It was a particular culture, assuming Christianity in Western Europe at the time. But that's what they did. And then they took these big residences that the wealthy Christians had and converted them into churches. They couldn't figure out where to have. They wanted to have one for Mary and one for Peter. And they didn't know where to put the one for Mary. And then snow fell on one hill, and that was where that's where they chose Santa Maria Maggiore. So, yeah, it's really neat to go to these three basilicas too in Rome, because they each have a separate history and they're magnificent panoplies. In fact, in general, the great cathedrals of Europe are living history, right? Absolutely living history. When the Schola, my choral group landed in Vienna, that's where we first landed on a European tour in 1989. The next day we sang Mass at the Stephansdom at St. Stephen's Basilica, the Cathedral Church of Vienna, and it was a larger side altar. I had the Mass, and then they were singing, and I knew that the people around there would know Mass 8. Sure enough, our kids start singing what's called Gregorian Mass 8, the Mass of the Angels. And this one beautiful family from India came over, children and all, they sang along. And by the time Mass was over, there was this group of people all singing Mass 8. It was marvelous. They all knew it in common, because it had been taught all over the world for centuries. And particularly during the first stage of liturgical movement, which was International Latin. Vernacular had not been introduced yet. The result is that many people's grandmother knows it. We noticed that in Los Angeles. If you want to get the old folks to sing, you go, Kyrie, they know exactly what to do, because they learned it as children. So that was really a cool experience. But I looked around, and I know a little more history than the kids did, and some of the families, and I looked and I saw the pipe organ back, and I said, yeah, that's the one that the Allies bombed, but they completely restored it. Some of those pipes are ones that were Haydn and Mozart played, and so on. See, so that, that's living history, right? And in Salzburg was never bombed. All of those instruments Mozart played on them, and stuff like that. It's remarkable. And living history. I cannot resist an aside. I started conducting at the Mozarteum one summer in Salzburg, and we were studying the Schubert Fifth Symphony, and this beautiful, beautiful girl was playing the flute part. And I went over and looked over and saw her music, and had little notations in ink. And I said, that's very old ink. And I checked to see what edition they had. And it looks like it was either Schubert's own notation, or more likely it was a student of his, because we're not convinced that all of this is published during his time, see? Okay, so I don't remember, and I didn't really look further into it, but I was struck by the fact that those editions they were using were living history too, and it makes it all the more powerful, So we don't have that as much in the United States. That's why I think that's why the inkling of our young people here is to have a more traditional looking church, because it feels more Catholic, because there's something very, very ongoing about the Catholic tradition. See, I'm not there anymore. I like the brand new, because I know the other part already. So I must remind myself that I was there once. And in a certain sense, I was luckier, because that's all we had at that time. You know, I mean, we were very, very traditional. The liturgy hadn't changed yet. We knew it was going to, but it hadn't done to yet. See, so I lived through all those changes. And I saw how beautiful the liturgy was. The Tridentine liturgy done right is absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. There's no question about that. And I'm glad that it can still be done. I think if people go to a Tridentine Mass once a year, it's a very good experience for them. It's very good for them. But I think, though, that the common experience of people today is they want a much more personally participated liturgy, just as we participate more in government than people did 100 years ago, even in the United States. They elected someone who went off to Washington and they forgot about it. You know, it was so far away anyway in those days, right? But now it's a different world and people want more, and they have these social, what's the term you use on the computer? The social, what? Social, that's the word I'm looking for, yeah. Social networks and stuff like that didn't even exist 10 years ago, right? And so, I mean, it's a very different world that way. The participated element, you know, when the kids say, I'm like, they're describing something, you know, they're constantly talking about the locus of human consciousness has focused away. The intellectus of man was always out there, objective truth. Now it's here. It's here, and then they have to find a way. They have their so-called universe of values. Well, if that's the case, the locus of liturgy, of the Tridentine liturgy, is out there. The locus of the modern liturgy is here, because it meets the need of modern man. It has to be the same exact faith, the exact same sacrament. And it is possible that it be so. A good liturgy would do both, see. And if it's anything, I think it's a very healthy sign that there's a conservative movement in students, if they genuinely reach out, though, to look for objective truth. And of course, there's a new balance, because we live in the era of the individual, but that's not what it's all about. Christianity is very, very communal and very, very vertical. So I mean, you know, but it's also immanent, right? It's Christological. It's not a distant God. Only that song, our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Yeah, that's one of the things he does, yeah. Okay, but he does much, much more than that. He came down to us. See, and therefore it's a very incomplete hymn. Very, very incomplete hymn. It's not wrong. It's just very incomplete, right? See, as long as kids understand that, I'm okay with the song, because it's fun to sing. But it's a good example, though, of there are better introits, right? Although it's a good one, it gets the blood flowing, which is definitely a plus. Okay, but it's a good example of how, if he had just, maybe the additional verses would have better, but see, that's the refrain, though. The refrain is not Trinitarian, and it's not Christological, and it's not clearly Christian. See, it's deistic, but it's a little more than deism, because it's not just a God who builds things, lets us take care of it. It's a God who somehow judges us and rules. So it's a little more. Okay, it's unquestionably the Islamic God for sure. It's probably the Jewish God, and it's part of the Christian God. But and I'm not saying that's necessarily bad in either of the three cases. But if it's a Christological service and the Eucharist is eminently Christological, then there should be a little more in the song. That's what I'm saying. In other words, the song. That's an example. There's so many. We're making definite mistakes still. But what's cool about it is the kids are singing, though. And they're using instruments that were not allowed in church. They were not allowed in church at all in church services in 1962. The guitar was not, Cardinal McIntyre had one time at his house here, had the great guitarist Andres Segovia for dinner one time, and he said to him, it would be wonderful to have the classical guitar someday in church, because the only the instrument allowed was the organ. See, pianos were not allowed, keyboards were not allowed, any other instrument was not, except the violin was not heard of. So you're just not allowed. Oh, in the great big masses, they would have a symphony orchestra, but that's an exception of the rule. So, I mean, the great strides were made to look back into history, but we've not gotten back to spontaneous chanting, have we? We haven't gotten very far, in fact. In fact, what have we done there? I still think it's a good question. You see how much there is to do. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my experience for over 40 years now as a priest is the part that people understand the least is the part that Vatican II wanted to really make sure was understood. The part that was completely silent with the priest back to the people, usually anyway, in the Tridentine liturgy, to make that, because that was the essence of the Eucharist experience. And it had been protected in quiet after the Reformation. Now was to be opened up and see. And I think that's a very good point. We could have gone right there, but if we'd done that, we'd have been talking about what the priest does and how we understand. And so our starting point here was, well, how do we participate? We participate in an outer ring pretty much, but if we don't know what's going on at that point in time, the mystagogical is lost and communion is less important. When a very wonderful young man who was very active in the young adult group I had at St. Anthony of Padua Parish in Gardenia said to me, well, you know, I married a girl who's Baptist. Well, you know, it's the same thing. Yeah, that's what he said. I thought to myself, you were an usher for years and years at the 5:30 youth mass, and you find a Baptist service identical or the same thing to a Roman Catholic mass? That amazes me. Not even President Carter would agree with that. He's a devout Baptist, a saintly man, I might add. But he certainly wouldn't say that. You know, so that's, you know, that's what this wonderful young man who's certainly bright and well educated, has a degree and everything like that, you know, said. I thought to myself, I guess I didn't do my job for 20 years, you know, when it came to him anyway, see. But at least his brother and his mother and sister-in-law are very devout Catholics still. But you never know how the people are affected by those things or whether they get it or not. So good for you. I agree with that 100%. But I think we have to really understand what an anaphora is, a Eucharistic prayer. Why is it structured the way it is? What does it do? How did it come about? How much of it is scriptural? How much is tradition? What is the, you know, there are two theologies as to when the Eucharist is changed to the body and blood of Christ. Did you know that? The Greeks say it takes place at the anamnesis, where the laying of the hands, okay, right before, calling upon the Holy Spirit. And the Latins say it's the words of institution. But the Arabs are not sure of either of those, because in the oldest canon we have of the Mass is in Syriac, Old Syriac, which is almost Aramaic. And there's no words of institution. They just hold up the gifts and think about it. See, and so it's too sacred, because remember, they don't pronounce the name of God. So apparently that's one of the theories. The reason why there's no words of institution is because in the ancient Hebrew tradition, the name of God was never pronounced. So
How far back does that date?
Time of just right after the apostolic times. Oh yeah, no, when they made the film, The Passion of the Christ, the film that, you know, they made, that they said they were doing it in Aramaic, that Jesus was speaking Aramaic. He wasn't speaking Aramaic. He was speaking Old Syriac, which is very close to Aramaic, which exists in northern Iraq and parts of Persia. It's called the Chaldean Rite, the Eastern Syrian Rite. And it's a very, very ancient part of the world. Life hasn't changed much. And the dialect spoken there is very close to what was spoken in Israel at the time of Christ. Imagine that. And their canon of Adi and Mari, two early patristic fathers, their Eucharistic prayer attributed to these two particular leaders of their church in maybe the 3rd century, 2nd century. It's all the way up to the point where there should be the words of institution. It may be that they didn't write them down so that they couldn't be desecrated. We don't know, but now in the Chaldean Rite, they just stop it in quiet and then continue. But they know what's going on. They're making the act of the will. It's very fascinating. See, so even the notion of words of institution is not the only, see, right? Yeah.
I'm just curious as to would that text have been modeled in some way after, like, Seder meal or some kind
Oh, yes, definitely. Oh, yeah, you don't know that. Okay, good. The great award given by the National Liturgical Institution is called the Erica Award. The Jewish kids at Chaminade refer to the Sabbath meal service as the berakot. They say it in plural. That's the plural form. Barakah means ritual blessing, blessing of food. And the difference is that instead of saying this bread and this wine reminds us of the food, it reminds us of our passage from slavery to freedom, from Israel to the promised land, to return to the promised land. Okay, that's the Jewish form. And then Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood. So everything up until that point was the Jewish Sabbath service for the Pasch. Okay, and then at that point in time, he surprises them by saying that. Well, we don't know how surprised they were, because he was already saying, I will give you my flesh to eat, my blood to drink. He was already saying that I'm the bread of life and so on. He was building up to it, see. But at the Eucharistic meal, which of course is renewed in the Eucharist, it isn't a separate, the Eucharist is never a separate event. It's a renewal of something which has already has taken place, and with time suspended is taking place again. So that's where the mystagogical aspect comes, and all of that, see, is lost on people unless properly explained. I don't think you get that by just hearing the words, Evidently not with that one man I mentioned anyway, right? And I really think that's true. The average kid who comes here does not get that powerful effect unless they know it already.
Loving Father, we thank you for the blessings and the beauty of this day, and the love of all people, for life itself and for one another. We ask you to help us in each in our own way to create and bring about and preserve a more peaceful and fraternal world for everyone in one world family. We thank you for the gift of our liturgy, which brings us together for that purpose, to make our prayer through Christ the Lord. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.